The RTX 4090 has been around for about a month now, and today sees us taking a look at the iCHILL X3 OC from INNO3D, which firstly, I have to admit, I'm kind of liking the name. It tells you everything you need to know about the cooler straight off the bat, along with telling us that it's an OC edition as well. So today we're going to drill down into the model, its cooler, and of course, how it performs. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
Andy, what are you watching?
It's not what you think.
Wow, it's so big!
Why, thank you. It's the new AOC AG493 UCX, 49 inches of pure performance and a refresh rate of 120 Hz. It's so fast. You can even do two at a time.
What?
You can connect two devices at a time and split the screen. With FreeSync Premium Pro, a 32:9 aspect ratio and a built-in KVM, you'll be finished in no time. Gaming, I mean. What did you think I mean? Get your mind out the gutter and click the link in the description to find out more. So by now, you're probably more than aware of how the RTX 4090 as a GPU actually performs. It absolutely obliterates the competition and is a huge generational leap from the monster 3090 Ti. But the issue always comes down to which model to go for, and of course which brand. Now, I'm more than aware that at launch it was a bit of a dash to pick up any model you could get your hands on, because they sold out so quickly. But as stock replenishes, and for those who, weren't bothered about getting hold of any model, you're now in a position where you can look at various models and make a well-informed decision as to what is better for your needs. So in terms of INNO3D, for the 4090, they've released a couple of different ranges, including the X3 OC and various iCHILL models, including the Frostbite and Black versions for those wanting a straight-out-the-box water-cooled solution for custom loop, and the iCHILL X3 OC model that we have here today. Now, I'll be honest, it's been quite some time since we've looked at anything from INNO3D, with the last card coming through here being the RTX 3050. Which I guess the less said the better about that one, though not through any fault of INNO3D, but more pinning the blame on Nvidia. That aside, let's talk about the iCHILL X3, because it's actually a very, very good looking card. Now, I'll be honest, there are some similarities with the design between it and offerings from Asus with the iCHILL branding when lit up, which actually does look pretty damn good. Now, like all RTX 4090 based cards, it's not small, but it is on the smaller end of the scale when compared to other 4090 cards on the market, coming in at 334mm long, 148mm high and 63mm thick. So it's a 3-slot card, and the cooler doesn't protrude over that either. Now, in terms of the overall design, it's plastic, and normally I hate on that, but with a mixture of textures, the mix between the black and kind of small amounts of grey and the overall design of the shroud, it works. It's no worse than kind of more established and more expensive models on the market, and the almost all black design means it will fit into your system perfectly. Now, like all RTX 4090s, it's a heavy boy, coming in at 2,335 grams, which is the heaviest 4090 we've had in our offices. But with weight also comes stability, and the iCHILL X3 really does feel like a solidly built card, which you'd expect if you're spending upwards of £1,600, which at the time of filming this, finding stock along with other 4090s is still proving somewhat difficult. But being a custom card as part of their high-end range, you'd expect it to cost more than the likes of a reference-based or founder's card. Now, as the name suggests, it has a triple fan design, which measure in around 92mm each, and almost kind of float within the frame, along with featuring both outer fans operating in an anti-clockwise rotation for reduced turbulence and superior cooling. Now, this is something we've definitely kind of seen become more common lately, and you'd like to think that INNO3D have done their own R&D to see the benefits of actually implementing this technology. Now, in terms of RGB, the iCHILL isn't for the faint-hearted. It has a couple of glossy panels scattered on the front, of which one actually wraps around to the top of the card, and is pretty in your face, but I like it. Not only is it bright, it's quite unique in the style and placement, and by default operates as a rainbow wave. Of course, you get full control within your motherboard's RGB software, or if you wish, you can turn it off completely depending on your style. Also, at the end of the RGB panel at the top, there is a connector, of which the card is meant to come with a cable so you can connect it up to a Asus or a sync. Sadly, with ours being a review sample, it didn't actually come with that cable, but for retail versions, it will be inside the box. Along the top is what Inno3D call the graphics card stand, which I think is maybe lost in translation a little bit because it's actually more of a support bar which stems from the middle of the card, all the way back to the top of the I/O bracket. So instead of the support only being from the I/O, which then screws into the PCB, you now get an extra piece of rigidity, which is also why I assume this card doesn't come with some kind of support stand, like we've seen from Asus, Gigabyte and MSI in the past. The one slightly strange thing is that you may struggle with screwing the card down into your case due to the length of the screws, as no longer ones come included with the card. Now around the back there's a full length backplate with a stylistic cutout to extract hot air away from the GPU's core, and the backplate along with the whole cooler spans well past the PCB, and has the same triangular pattern that we see on the RGB elements, which is also similar to the triangular design that Corsair have been using on their cases for a little while now. So maybe that would match in as well. Now along with the style elements, the backplate is fairly thick and will assist with sag along with that top bracket, or stand as they call it. Now in terms of branding, the fans incorporate the iCHILL branding and logo, along with the same iCHILL branding on the backplate, and the GeForce RTX logos on the backplate and along the top of the card, while the RGB on the top gives more iCHILL branding once in operation. For power, like all other RTX 4090s on the market, it's a 12+4 pin connector, of which a lot of chatter has been going on about melting cables and connectors, but we've not experienced any issues so far, and general talk within the industry could actually come down to multiple adapters made in various ways, along with user error. Now for this card, it comes with an adapter, which includes 3 8-pins to the 12+4 pin connector, unlike other cards that have 4 8-pin connectors. This is more than enough though, as this card has a 450 watt total board power, so 3 connectors is more than enough for it. On the I/O, as mentioned, it will take up 3 physical slots inside your case, and the cooler matches along with that, without kind of protruding out beyond those 3 slots. 2 of these slots have ventilation to assist with cooling, while connection-wise, we have 3 DisplayPort 1.4a ports and a single HDMI 2.1a port, much like we've seen on all other RTX 4090s so far. Things get really interesting with this card when we tear down the cooler. The shroud and fans come away as a single piece and have 3 connections for power and RGB lighting. And underneath this is where we find a single large heatsink which comprises of a large vapor chamber to help dissipate any heat away from the GPU core and of course the GDDR6X memory through the 9 heat pipes, of which 2 of them that make contact towards the middle of the cold plate are much smaller, and therefore they terminate just above the PCB, while the other 7 span the whole length of the large cooler to help carry heat away from that PCB. The heatsink also has a frame around it holding it in place for rigidity and to add extra stability to the PCB, as the heatsink is where the bulk of the weight comes from, with its huge surface area of fins and that added bracket. There is another small bracket that adds strength to the end of the cooler, as this overhangs dead space due to the small PCB, so adding extra reinforcement here was definitely a good idea, and goes to show that you have a great quality product that is better than what we've actually seen from bigger brands on the market. Once the backplate is removed, it's easy to see that it's a lot thicker than other GPUs we've had through here, and again, it's likely due to the large and heavy heatsink that's been slapped on it to add extra support when needed. The PCB looks to be referenced and is pretty typical of what we've come to expect from this generation of GPUs, coming in at 200mm long and around 120mm high, so smaller than the Gaming OC from Gigabyte that we looked at recently. Now, though it's small, the space looks to be utilised very well, with a total of 12 micro-branded GDDR6X memory ICs, all with 2GB capacities. Each side includes 7 power phases, giving us a total of 14, of which Inno3D decided to go for the Alpha and Omega AOZ5311NQI power stages, which comprises of 2 asymmetrical MOSFETs working in a high side, low side configuration for the best optimised performance. Each power stage is rated for 55 amps of continuous output current, up to 80 amps for a 10 millisecond pulse, and up to 120 amps for a 10 microsecond pulse. For the GDDR6X memory, the GPU has 3 controllers in total on the rear of the PCB, and all were made by UPI Semiconductor, or UPI, depending on how you want to read it. Now, 2 of them are variants of the UP9512 controller, which is fairly new and kind of seems to be specifically made for this particular GPU, while the other is the UPI US5650Q, which acts as a 4-channel analog pre-filter and multiplexer. Now for the literal elephant in the room, we have the world's first 4nm GPU core, codenamed Ada Lovelace, with a 76.3 billion transistor count and 680mm squared die size. At the top right of the PCB, we find our 12+4 pin power connector, which is rated due to the cable at 600 watts, so more than enough for this particular card, which has a total board power of 450 watts. In terms of the specs, this is an OC card, as are all cards that make up part of the iCHILL series, and because of that we see a slight increase in the boost clock compared to a reference spec. Now when compared to the 2520MHz boost clock on the RTX 4090 founders, Inno3D have increased that to 2580MHz, and with help of that chunky cooler, should be able to sustain that level of boost for a sustained amount of time. Now when looking at how the iCHILL X3 card compares to the slightly slower boost speed of the 4090 Gaming OC from Gigabyte, we do see some interesting results. So starting things off with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, where we see the Inno3D 4090 coming in at 137 FPS, with a 1% low of 74. Now compared to the slightly lower speed of the Gigabyte Gaming OC, which came in 1.5% slower, it's nothing you'd likely notice in game at such a high frame rate anyway. Within Cyberpunk, the Inno3D sits with a 6% lead over the Gaming OC. Of course, you could argue this is margin of error or a small win for the great job the cooler is doing to keep that sustained level of boost. In Death Stranding, we see a small 4% uplift in the performance moving from the Gigabyte Gaming OC up to the Inno3D. The 1% low show a similar story with less than a 4% lead over the Gigabyte card. Lastly, in Watch Dogs, we see similar performance with very close figures between all three of the RTX 4090 models that we tested, with no clear winner based on the margins that we saw. Though you could argue the Gigabyte card just edges forward considering it has the slowest boost speeds of all the cards tested. So that gives us a small sample of how the Inno3D 4090 compares to other 4090s that we've tested, and where it kind of sits between other cards as well. But to get a better idea of what Inno3D have done, we put the card under an hour-long stress test within F122 at 4K on max settings. What we saw here was our GPU temperature bouncing around the 65° mark, while the hotspot temperature went to 75°, and the memory to 70°. Now in terms of the fan speed, it was actually on the lower end of the scale, at just under 1600 RPM, so not overly noisy at 45 decibels. Though this card does have a total board power of 450 watts as per Nvidia's spec, though through our stress test we didn't really see this peak above 425 watts. Now when looking at the overclock performance of the card, we did manage to squeeze some fairly decent numbers out of the card, though there was no extra power to unlock due to Nvidia's constraints, so we were limited to the 450 watts that this card has. Though we did actually manage to see a core clock increase of 160 MHz and a memory clock increase of 1100 MHz, which saw the core clock now boosting to 2910 MHz and the memory at 2900 MHz or 23.2 gigabits per second. This did result in the temperatures increasing slightly, up to 66 degrees on the GPU and 72 degrees on the memory, while the GPU hotspot temperature remained the same at 75 degrees. Due to the slight increase in temperature, this did see the fans ramp up slightly to just over 1600 RPM, which resulted in a noise reading of 47 decibels, so slightly up from the 45 decibels that we had at stock. Due to the fact that the power limits weren't able to be changed, we saw the same power output of around 425 watts during our stress test. So some pretty impressive numbers with everything seemingly under control. It's always a bit of a give and take when it comes to cooling performance, as it's about striking the balance between lower temperatures and without sounding like a jet engine, which the iCHILL X3 manages to do quite well. Now compared to the Gigabyte Gaming OC on the GPU temperature, the Gaming OC did come in slightly cooler by around 3 degrees. But that's expected considering the higher fan speed, though this didn't actually generate any more noise and did end up using slightly less power compared to the Inno3D model, but only by a margin of around 3%. But with the iCHILL X3 having more RGB, this could account for a small amount of power draw anyway. When overclocked, the GPU temperature did rise ever so slightly, and due to this the fan speed also ramped up a little too, while the comparison Gigabyte card remained at the same temperature. Moving on to the hotspot, and it's a similar story again with the Gigabyte card just coming in with slightly lower temperatures, albeit by 2%. But that sticking point really being that the iCHILL X3 card comes in with a fan speed that's around 200 RPM lower. Finally, the memory was where we saw the biggest difference and not in favour of the Inno3D card, where the Gaming OC from Gigabyte actually came in better by 10 degrees, which is quite some margin. This again is likely down to the slightly more aggressive fan speed on the Gigabyte card, though at 70 degrees on the memory, it's still nothing I'd worry about anyway. Again, when overclocked, we did see a slight increase in the memory temperature by around 2 degrees, but due to having the same power limit, even when overclocked, it didn't seem to go any higher. Now, when looking at power consumption, during our F122 stress test, we did see the Inno3D card using, I guess, slightly more power than the game in OC, which in the US, based on the current average rate of electricity, it would see it costing around 1/5 of a cent more per hour to run continuously, which is neither here nor there in the grand scheme of things. For a slightly easier to understand explanation is that it would cost you an extra 1 cent in electricity over the Gigabyte card every 5 hours of gaming on average. So not really anything to worry about. Now in the UK it's a very similar story, though our prices here are somewhat more expensive on average as a whole. But here the Inno3D card will end up costing you just under half a penny more to run per hour on average during gaming. Again, it's nothing massive, but it is something worth discussing nonetheless. So the Inno3D iCHILL X3 OC card. As I mentioned, it's the first card we've had from them in quite a while, and that gives me the opportunity to see how far they've come for a brand that in some regions just isn't known, like the US. Now I can definitely say that they've stepped up their game dramatically, and if priced right, could be a great contender on the market. The design clearly does have some influences from other brands on the market, and I honestly don't see anything wrong with that, because if you can do something similar while also being competitive, then as a consumer myself, I'm all for it. Now I'll be honest and say that it's definitely a good looking card and is on the smaller end of the scale compared to other RTX 4090s, though I know that's not really saying much when they're all monumentally huge. Now to combat some of the issues that come with a big card, I'm liking the support bracket that makes up part of this card. Instead of having something that resembles a Mario flagpole holding up your GPU, I get that brands are making them better looking, but this just, I don't know, I feel this is the better option overall. And it, doesn't involve the user doing anything to set it up. It's just on the card as standard. Now, in terms of build quality, I can't really fault it. I mean, it's a bit plasticky on the front, which is expected, because I don't think they're really aiming to take on the likes of Asus or other extremely high-end cards, which, also demand a higher premium. But instead, they're trying to kind of strike that balance between value, materials used, and keeping a design that fits in with your system. Though personally, a mix of materials would have been welcomed, especially as they could potentially match it to kind of, synchronize in with the backplate a little bit. Now, when it comes to performance, it is an RTX 4090, so you'd expect nothing less than the very best. And it's taken that performance and just dialed it up ever so slightly, thanks to that out-of-the-box overclock, which does see it pushing ahead of the other 4090 that we compared it to, the Gigabyte Gaming OC. Now obviously, along with the slightly lower fan speed, this does result in slightly higher temperatures. But with the GPU and the hotspot temperatures only having a kind of 2 degree difference, it's nothing that's overly concerning. The memory temperature difference of 10 degrees is, I guess, a more striking point. But again, still sits within comfortable limits, so I'm not really that worried. But I guess it does give Inno3D something to work on for future releases, because I'd maybe argue that it's probably the weakest point of the card. Now overall, it's been great getting an Inno3D card into the offices again, and it's always good to see some maybe lesser known brands on our test bench to see how they're doing things a little bit differently to, some of the market leaders, Asus, Gigabyte, MSI. Now, I'll comment now to say, if the price is right on this, and it's tricky because it's currently out of stock, but if the price is right on this, I think you'll be expected to pay a slight premium over a reference spec or a founder's card. And, you'll not be wasting your money for what you're actually getting. And it will still come in cheaper than an Asus TUF or MSI Supreme X model. So you could always spend that extra money elsewhere, like towards a new CPU or more memory. Because at the end of the day, it's still an RTX 4090. So you're not going to be disappointed in the performance regardless. So that about wraps up this video. So let me know what you think in the comments section below. Would you pick up an Inno3D RTX 4090 iCHILL X3 OC? Or have you maybe got your eyes solidly focused on another RTX 4090 from another brand maybe? As you're probably more than aware, we do have the RTX 4080 launch coming up, so definitely make sure you're subscribed for that, along with tons of other cool content coming very, very soon. We're actually taking this card and testing it across a variety of different CPUs, so you won't want to miss that. Either way, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be absolutely amazing. And if you love what we do and just can't get enough, then follow the link down below to support us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to our super special secret area over on Discord, exclusive behind the scenes content, and much, much more. Thanks for checking out this video, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.